Welcome back to Core Conversations, a CoreLogic podcast. I am your host, Maiclaire Bolton Smith, and I'm the Senior Leader of Research and Content Strategy with CoreLogic. In this podcast, we'll have conversations with industry experts about key topics from housing affordability to the impacts of natural disasters on property. So far in this podcast, we've talked about earthquakes, hurricanes, hail, and extreme cold. Today, we're going to talk about another very common peril, tornadoes. The US has the highest frequency of tornadoes globally, with an average over 1,000 recorded each year. Canada, a distant second, has around 100 tornadoes annually. So it's no wonder that the American collective consciousness is filled with its appearance, whether it's Dorothy getting swept away to Oz or Pecos Bill lassoing a twister. But in real life, tornadoes aren't nearly as charming as the stories make them out to be. They can arrive relatively unannounced and with their hundreds of miles an hour winds decimate everything in their paths before disappearing, destroying homes and lives in the process. So far this year has been devastating for tornadoes across the Midwest and the Southeast US. So for our episode today, I'm joined by Curtis McDonald, meteorologist and senior product manager for Weather Forensic Solutions, to talk about one of his greatest passions, tornadoes. Curtis, welcome to Core Conversations.
Thanks, Maiclaire. So excited to be here and yes, talk about one of my favorite weather phenomenons, tornadoes. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So to get started today, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your background and your role here at CoreLogic?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Maiclaire mentioned, I'm a product manager and my background is actually in meteorology. So I oversee a wide suite of our forensic weather products here at CoreLogic. So we have developed a unique set of proprietary algorithms that allow us to derive numerous different actual products, ranging from mapping hailstorms to mapping straight line winds and hurricanes, as well as tornadoes. So that's what we're here today to talk about. And I work through that from a product perspective and building out and working with our clients to understand how they can leverage these tools and these technologies to help solve the problems that they face, specifically within the insurance industry.
Great. So in episode 2 of this podcast, we featured Dr. Daniel Betton, who I know is not only a close colleague, but also a close friend of yours. And the two of you have storm chased together. So Daniel shared with us how he was fascinated by weather and storm chasing as a young child. Was that the same for you? How did you know you wanted to be a meteorologist?
Yeah, also very, very similar story to Daniel. So I actually I grew up outside of St. Louis, Missouri, and one of my earliest memories as a child was the Great Flood of 1993. So that I got hooked on really watching that coverage of that over the course of the entire summer of '93, and that really just led to my fascination of weather even further. In addition, my mother, she was pretty terrified of thunderstorms. So anytime we had thunderstorms, she would, almost pack her bags and take us down to the basement no matter what. So I think that also spurred some interest of why she was so fascinated and concerned and panicked really around thunderstorms. So I think those kind of combinations led me to really always be, as long as I can remember, very interested in weather. Ultimately led to the decision to move to Oklahoma and attend the University of Oklahoma for my schooling.
Wow. Well, I can identify with your mother there too, getting scared by them. So does your mother get scared when you're storm chasing and putting yourself in harm's way? I just have to ask.
Yes. Well, I think initially she did, but I've been doing it now for almost 15 years or over 15 years, I guess. And seeing over 100 tornadoes, I think it's a little bit easier for her. And I actually convinced her to come out with me once. And so she got to see a tornado herself. So I think that also helped. But she said that would be her last. It was her first and her last. But
well, I think I would be along with her there. So, okay, well, let's dive into tornadoes. So most weather phenomena are seasonal. We know that hurricanes occur in the summer and in the fall. Winter storms obviously occur in the winter. And the spring usually sees most severe weather like hail, lightning, and tornadoes. So is tornado season the same across the country? And are there areas that are more at risk than others?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And really the peak of tornado activity or tornadic activity rather is occurring in the months of April and May across the US. But tornadoes can really occur at any point throughout the entire calendar year.
Oh, wow.
But there's a couple things that we can look at in terms of delineating areas that might be highest at risk in any given year. So one things that drive severe weather activity primarily in parts of the Plain States and into Dixie Alley or the Southeast is La Nina or El Nino. So that's a condition of the coolings of the surface waters out in the equatorial Pacific, whether it's if it's cooler than average, that's going to be a La Nina. If they're warmer than average, that's going to be an El Nino. And this year we are in a moderate La Nina, which typically translate to more severe weather earlier on in the spring season across Dixie Alley. And we've certainly seen that this year already across parts of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, with unfortunately, some deadly tornadoes that we've already experienced. But as the season kind of goes later, as we go into April and May, we'll typically start to see that the greatest threat areas for tornadoes and severe thunderstorms in general starting to shift to the north and west. So as we approach April, we'll start seeing, as we're in April, start seeing more activity in Oklahoma and Texas. And as we go into May, we'll start seeing that kind of start to spread northward into parts of Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas. And then as we go into maybe the late spring and into the summer months, it'll even go even further north into the central and northern plains. And then as we get into the mid to late summer, that's when Canada typically sees its most active tornadic activity. So just in general, as we head from early spring to mid to late summer, it's going to shift from kind of the southeast Dixie Alley and then northwest all the way up into Canada.
Interesting. And you mentioned Dixie Alley, and I think most people are familiar with Tornado Alley. And Tornado Alley is more the Midwest, Oklahoma, correct? Oklahoma, Kansas-ish area, Dorothy country?
Yeah, so some of it's just the delineation and just typically we see, historically speaking, in the months of April and May, that's where you have most of the tornadoes occurring. Is your kind of classic tornado alley, if you will, kind of stretches from North Texas through Oklahoma and Kansas and in parts of Missouri and Nebraska. But Dixie Alley is certainly an area that gets just as many tornadoes, if not more. And as we, some interesting things as we see. As social media and cell phones and technology, you're having a lot more, you're able to capture a lot more of those tornadoes in those areas. And I think it's largely due to the fact that historically speaking, we have a lot of trees and a lot of terrain issues for seeing tornadoes in the Southeast. So a lot of those have gone unrecorded or reported versus out in the Plain States, you can see, tornadoes for as upwards of 10 to 15 miles away. You don't have that luxury really in Dixie Alley. So a lot of the times, especially back through the 70s, 80s, when cell phones weren't prevalent, a lot of those tornadoes were occurring. They just weren't being reported.
Right.
So in fact, some of the more recent research, there's actually more tornadic activity across parts of Dixie Alley versus the classic tornado alley, if you will.
Wow, that's really interesting. And when I look at this year in particular, we've seen so much activity and devastating, as you mentioned, in Georgia and Alabama. And so that would be considered Dixie Alley?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And parts of Tennessee as well. Really just in that general Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee.
Okay. So I guess if we look back at this year in particular and thinking back in recent years, I know when I look back at, in my childhood and history, there's a lot of really devastating tornadoes that stood out to me. I grew up in Canada. I know there was one in Edmonton when I was a child that was probably one of the worst ones that we'd ever had in Canada at the time. But in recent years, 2011 really stands out, Joplin, Missouri. If we look at, the history and this 2021 season and kind of the history, like what's the most severe we've seen this year so far? And how does it compare to some of those big ones in history?
Yeah, so we certainly saw, as I mentioned early on, in Georgia, we saw an EF4 tornado that already took place this year, and unfortunately did take several lives. It was a very long track tornado. We've seen actually several long track tornadoes this year in March, and particularly late March. In terms of how they relate to the 2011 season, 2011 was certainly a once in a generation type year for
Mhm.
sure, in terms of not only the number of tornadoes that we saw, but the strength of those tornadoes. Tornadoes are occurring every single year, but we typically don't see widespread EF4, EF5 tornadoes, which 2011 we saw that on numerous different events, different outbreaks. April 27th being one of the largest in history, and that's going to be the Dixie Alley area. That was the Tuscaloosa, Alabama tornado that took place, and then later on in May is when the Joplin tornado occurred, which killed over 100 people, which is really staggering, and just to think about from a perspective of where we're at and from a technology perspective. So you got to kind of go back from back in I think it's the mid 1920s when we had the tri-state tornado, which was the from a fatality perspective the most devastating tornado that's on the books from a historical perspective.
So you mentioned tri-states. Can you just define which states were impacted?
Yeah, so that's the tornado that tracked through southern Missouri, southeastern Missouri, through all of Illinois, and then actually went into Indiana. So that was the 3 states that were impacted back in the mid 1920s.
Wow. So you mentioned the EF scale a few times, and I know people that watch Twister are familiar a little bit with tornado scales, but can you talk just a little bit about the enhanced Fujita scale and what the different levels are and the levels of damage and what they all mean? I think that's just important for us to kind of clarify.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very similar. I think more people are familiar with the hurricane scale. So rating a hurricane from a Category 1 to Category 5. We have something very similar on the tornado scale. It's based upon the wind speeds and in essence the amount of damage that those tornadoes cause. So it does start out at EF0, which stands for, as you already mentioned, Maiclaire, Enhanced Fujita. So it used to be just the F scale, but I think it was probably about 10 years ago or so, we went through and reevaluated some of the wind speeds, and it's now we have the Enhanced Fujita scale. So that ranges from an EF0 all the way up to an EF5. EF5 being the most significant, and that really equates to wind speeds that exceed 200 miles per hour will receive an EF5 rating. And really, when you get to wind speeds at that magnitude, there's really not much that is not going to be impacted by that. So that's when you'll see homes being completely wiped off their foundation. You're just left with essentially a concrete slab. So those are the most devastating tornadoes, and unfortunately they make up a very small percentage of the tornadoes that occur, but they certainly can be extremely destructive.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. Okay, and just bouncing back to the tri-state tornado again. So would that one be considered the most devastating tornado in history then?
Yeah, I think it really just how you classified the term devastating, because when you look at tornadoes, there's the more significant piece is the loss of life, and then there's also the financial impacts from a tornado. The most deadly tornado from that perspective was the tri-state tornado, where the records show I think over 600 fatalities occurred with that storm or that tornado. So pretty significant. And then from a loss perspective, from a dollar perspective, the Joplin, Missouri tornado in 2011, with losses approaching, or some estimates are now exceeding $3 billion from total damages from that tornado.
Wow, it's absolutely frightening and terrifying and just devastating what tornadoes can do because of the way they just can decimate everything in their paths. And that's what makes them so scary, which is why I'm not sure why you like chasing them. But I do want to jump into this a little bit, because you did mention, and we talked a little bit off the top, that you are a storm chaser. And over the years, you have sent me some pretty terrifying photos when you were out in the field and videos. And can you just talk a little bit about your experience doing some tornado chasing? And I know just tell us a little bit about why you do it and what you've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. So When I came to the school back in 2005, my first storm chase actually was what I consider my first real storm chase. Now, I did some as soon as I got my driver's license, and even before I got my driver's license, I convinced my mom actually to drive me around. It took a lot to get her to do that, given that she
Wow.
does have a fear of storms. But once I got into school and met other people like Daniel that you talked about,
Mhm.
became good friends with him. I really got into storm chasing starting in 2006. And I really chased a lot in the spring of 2006, and we didn't see really anything in the spring. However, I loved every aspect of it. I loved going out and seeing the structure of the thunderstorms, these supercell thunderstorms that are producing these tornadoes. Seeing the large hail and just being able to experience that firsthand. It really doesn't do justice just learning about it in a textbook. So going out into the field and seeing it, and just seeing how these storms, breathe and live is something that's hard to describe. But then as time went on, my first tornado that I actually saw was in September of 2006. It was actually in the fall. It was actually in South Dakota. So we drove from Oklahoma all the way up to South Dakota, and I got to experience my first real tornado, and just something that I'll obviously never forget. And then from there, like I said, I was hooked and went on to do it quite heavy, I would say, through college. Me and Daniel and some other friends, we started our own business doing it. Selling videos to news networks and so forth.
Oh,
But
wow.
during that time, I've seen, like I mentioned, over 100 tornadoes now, including the Moore EF5 tornado that occurred in 2013.
Wow.
2013 was a pretty significant year for tornadoes as well. And for me, from a chasing career perspective, I back to back days, I saw an EF4 tornado in Kansas, followed by an EF4 tornado in Oklahoma. On the east side of Oklahoma City, near a town called Shawnee, Oklahoma, and then the very next day was the Moore EF5 tornado. So going 3 back-to-back days of EF4, 2 back-to-back days of EF4, and then the third day in EF5. Something that, from a career perspective, I'll probably never top, and hopefully I don't. Because the Moore tornado was one that actually impacted and destroyed a lot of lives, unfortunately,
Yeah.
in a
Wow.
big city. So
Wow. Yeah, and I actually was in Oklahoma a few years after and still saw some of the damage from the Moore, Oklahoma tornado. It was just unbelievable, the impact that it did have. So I guess if we kind of relate I love how you call it your storm chasing career, to kind of what we do here at CoreLogic. And can you talk a little bit about what do you do with the data and observations that you're collecting while you're storm chasing, and how we work that into some of the products at CoreLogic?
yeah, so one of the very unique things that we do at CoreLogic is we have developed a very robust way of incorporating not only the weather radar data
Mm.
for some of our proprietary models and algorithms. These are the weather radars that there's over 100 of those across the U.S., and they are sending out pulses of energy that measure different particulates within the atmosphere, so raindrops, hailstones, but it can even pick up on like insects and birds. It gives us information back, what's going on from a storm perspective. However, there's significant limitation to just utilizing the weather radar data. One of the biggest limitations is as you move out away from the weather radar in space, so our geography rather, due to the curvature of the Earth, that radar is looking further and further up off the ground. So if you move out
Oh,
from a
wow.
weather radar, let's say 100 miles or so, you might be looking 8 to 10,000 feet above the ground. So a lot can change, let's say, from a hailstone perspective, or a tornado. You might not even see the tornado looking 10,000 feet above the ground. So there's things
Wow.
that we have to do to overcome those limitations of the weather radar, and by building in the quality controlled ground observations. So coming in from either from ourselves when we're out storm chasing, or coming in from social media or other sources that we have. We actually look at every single observation, every single report is looked at by a meteorologist before it then goes into our algorithm, and then it again works to help overcome those limitations of the weather radar itself.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's really interesting, and I love how, social media has become a tool that can really be used to build up a data resource and really help to influence and improve products, which I'm not sure anybody really ever anticipated when social media launched.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of there's probably a lot of good that comes out of social media. There is some
Hmm.
bad too. So that's
Yeah.
why we have to look at
Quality control.
quality control that stuff. So we have to look at every single report just to make sure that make sure it's valid and makes sense before it goes into our algorithms. Absolutely.
Sure, yeah. Wow. So managing tornado risk is important for insurers and financial institutions. At CoreLogic, we like to say, know your risk to help accelerate your recovery. We look both at the risk before and after the storm. And before, we know it's important to help manage and mitigate the risk, but I want to talk more about the after part. So, weather forensic data is really vital in helping understand damage patterns and potential impacts in a relatively short amount of time. So, can you tell us a little bit more about weather forensic data and how it's used and how it can help the insurance industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the more important things with tornadoes is understanding as quick as you can the magnitude in terms of how strong it was, how wide it was, how long was it on the
Mhm.
ground, and a lot of that information is very hard to come by immediately after a tornado. There's just a lot of chaos. There's a lot of communication channels are down. And sometimes in a lot of cases, tornadoes are occurring at night. So it makes it even more
Right.
difficult to
Yeah.
see what has been impacted. So with our technology, what was one thing that we really wanted to provide value in is just the timeliness of it. So we have a solution that updates every 15 minutes. So again, aggregating that weather radar data with the observational data. We're able to output, with confidence, probability levels of where we think the tornadic damage occurred. And for the insurance side of things, being able to overlay all of their policies of their customers and quickly know which ones were likely impacted is very valuable. So
Wow.
instead of waiting, maybe the next day or the next afternoon, an actual claim comes in from the customer, they can get ahead of that by utilizing our data and understanding again how many of their customers potentially were impacted.
Wow. Yeah. So that almost near real time intel just to help moving forward with processing
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
I guess that would then, in turn, from a homeowner's perspective, potentially help speed up claim payments for a homeowner.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, as quick the as we can, we get that information out, and then the insurance will use that information to mobilize their response to that tornado or that storm. So having as quick as they can get that information, the quicker they can get their resources into motion, as well as maybe even start working a claim before a claim actually even gets filed by the homeowner.
Wow, that's unbelievable. That's great. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we talked about this with hurricanes and with winter storms as well. So can you say anything about climate change and what it might mean for the future of tornadoes and severe weather?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there's still a lot of unknowns in this area for sure. And one of the biggest
Right.
reasons for that is when you think about tornadoes, the size of them compared to a hurricane and a winter storm, for example, it's much smaller. So in terms of saying with certainty what exactly is going to happen from a increase or decrease from a tornado perspective is really challenging. One thing that we can look at is the severe and convective storm, which is thunderstorms in general or severe storms producing hail and strong winds and tornadoes.
Mm.
What could happen with those? And one of the things there's really two components of severe thunderstorms that drive the severity of those storms, and it really comes down to wind shear as well as instability. Instability is made up of first off, you need to have very warm and moist air at the surface, so near the ground. And as surface temperatures rise globally, we can see increased moisture content at the surface. So that increased moisture content can lead to essentially greater instability. And one of the other things, though, on the opposite side of this is the wind shear perspective. In order to have these storms, you need to have stronger wind shear. And wind shear is essentially just there's two different types of wind shear. You can have what we call speed shear, which is the speeds of winds change as you go up off the surface of the earth. So they get stronger and stronger. And there's also directional shear. So as you move off the surface of the earth, the winds will change direction with height. So those are two types of shear, and those are largely driven by temperature gradients in the different mid-levels and upper levels of the atmosphere. So as we see increased temperatures at those levels, we might actually potentially see a decrease in the amount of wind shear. So that's kind of the two. You might have increased instability at one side of it, but you might have decreased shear on the other side. So that's just one areas or a couple areas that I guess a lot of the researchers are looking at currently and try to get a better understanding of how those can essentially cancel each other out, or maybe they won't. Maybe we'll actually see an increase in severe and convective storm activity because we have more instability and higher moisture content. So it's just some things that we're looking at, and ultimately, I think as over the next several years, we'll have a much better understanding of how this could all evolve from a severe and convective storm perspective. It's certainly a challenging question, challenging thing to consider. And there's, like I mentioned, there's still a lot of research going into it today.
Yeah, and just fascinating. And I mean, with climate change, so much is changing and so much is unknown. So yeah, only time will tell that we really start to learn more on what the full impact could be. So, well,
Absolutely.
Curtis, this has been so great. Thank you for bringing your passion and bringing your excitement and sharing with us too, not only, I guess, the scientific side of things, and how what you do, even though it might be crazy with your storm chasing career, it really has a good behind it, because it's really trying to understand what's happening to ultimately help protect people, so that we can learn more about these storms. So thank you for sharing that and for joining me today on Core Conversations, a CoreLogic podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, and I'll have to work on getting you out to Oklahoma soon to see a tornado.
Or not. So, so for more information on the property market and the housing economy, please visit corelogic.com/insights. And for more information on natural catastrophe events and even sometimes images from Curtis when he's out storm chasing, visit us at hazardhq.com. Thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed our latest episode. Please remember to leave us a review and let us know your thoughts, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to be notified when new episodes are released. And thanks again to the team for helping bring this podcast to life. Producer Ria Tarakia, editor and sound engineer Romy Roman, and social media guru Mike Wojcik. Tune in next time for another Core Conversation.